Great. Thank you, Sandra, and welcome everyone. And thanks for the invitation. My name is Stephen Tobin. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Labor Market Information Council. And I'm joined here today by Anthony, who really is the person with all the skills and knowledge here. So he'll be able to answer all of your tough questions. And in fact, what I'm hoping to do is really kind of raise some issues and challenges that we've kind of faced in this space over really the last few years. But maybe just quickly before I begin, for those who are not familiar, the Labor Market Information Council is a relatively new not-for-profit, so we've been around for about 3 years and a bit. Our mandate, I think, is pretty aligned kind of with the discussion we're going to have today, which is in essence to provide labor market information to help Canadians kind of navigate employment career related decisions, right? And so one thing to keep in mind for us, I think, as a not-for-profit is we are, at our core, objective and really unbiased. So our goal is really, it's apolitical in nature. We're governed by all of the provinces and territories as well as the federal government. And so our goal really is just to make labor market information better in Canada so Canadians can make more informed choices. And so in thinking about the topic today, two kind of reflections, I would say. The first is when we think about labor market information and how we can support Canadians, one of the biggest gaps we see is information with respect to skills. In short, it's a bit of a mess. And so we're really trying to work and understand and participating in sort of sessions like this so we can really kind of better understand the needs of the various actors, be it training and education institutes, employers, career practitioners, or employment sort of service providers, really kind of the people who are helping people, really. And so I think that for us is a great opportunity to kind of learn and hear about some of your issues. I guess when thinking about this topic, certainly Anthony will go into a little bit more detail in terms of the way we're thinking about this sort of broad issue of how can we sort of better articulate skills. I thought it might be useful to take a little bit of a step back in terms of how we got as an organization to really where we are today. And prior to joining LMIC, as I said, a little more than 3 years ago, I was working outside of the country. And so was at least only, somewhat sort of aware of the things that were taking place in Canada, but probably not in as much detail as all of you. But I think in kind of explaining our path as an organization and even my own understanding of how we got to understanding skills, I think would be maybe a little bit helpful for framing the discussion. So when we kind of launched the organization 3 years ago, Anthony had also joined about the same time. Obviously pre-pandemic, what we heard consistently was shortages. Everywhere we turned, people were talking about shortages. And even now in sort of the COVID world, despite still very, very high unemployment, we still hear talk and discussions about shortages. And so one thing we investigated as an organization, what exactly were people talking about? And it was quite clear that, whether or not we were talking to employers or employer associations or people or workforce planning boards, there was an obvious sort of confusion between a labor shortage and a skill shortage. And you would see articles in CBC confusing two of them. Even academic papers that we reviewed would kind of mix these two issues together, which was kind of a bit of a shock for us to kind of uncover that this confusion was so widespread, given that they fundamentally require completely different things in terms of policy responses, right? And so for us, in thinking about kind of the extreme of the distinction between the two. I mean, a labor shortage is really when you have a vacancy and no one applies. Like there's really no one there, which obviously necessitates a completely different kind of policy response. We either need to encourage people to move to your area or apply to your firm, because maybe what's happening is people aren't interested in working where you have the job to offer. Or it's other measures like immigration, right? Either from other provinces or territories, or international immigration. And that's very, very different than a situation where you have a pool of applicants applying, but they are not deemed to have the right skill set, quote unquote, to sort of take up that job. And so this distinction was really important for us when talking to our board members from the federal government and provincial territorial ministries around how to address either a labor shortage or a skill shortage. And so this kind of the logical next step for us kind of in that process was, okay, well, labor shortage, we can kind of understand, right? It's pretty straightforward. There's either a pool of applicants or not. There's some data, although it's not great, in terms of the number of unemployed people in a given region, et cetera. And so there's at least some data around how which you can sort of tackle this issue, albeit with a whole set of other challenges. But when we started to dig into, all right, what do we understand about skill shortages, and sort of being economists, for us, we think about it really from two different lenses. So it's, what do individuals have in terms of skills versus what's kind of being demanded. And only then can you really kind of think about, all right, what does this mean in terms of a shortage? So are employers asking for something that an individual doesn't have within the skills space? So we were still, I honestly, personally was still relatively naive to the skills space 2 years ago. And in thinking about the data and examining what was available, we realized that the most obvious one was what Statistics Canada refers to as skill level. But of course, skill level, when you look underneath, it simply meant whether or not you had a credential or a qualification. But it wasn't skills at all. It was in fact talking about credentials and qualifications. And so the good thing around education and qualifications is that our system is very well developed, right? And it's been in place for decades. So we have information on whether or not an individual has a bachelor's degree or not. Do they have a college level certificate or not, master's, et cetera. And so pretty good data in terms of kind of the individual or supply side around whether or not you have a qualification. And an equally good system in terms of what Statistics Canada refers to as the typical skill level required, again, qualification required for any given level occupation across the country. And so we sort of realized that what we as a system have been doing for decades is essentially using qualifications and credentials as sort of a measure or proxy of skills. And in looking at kind of the supply side and the demand side, we kind of realized that, of course, and this is kind of the good news, that the number of individuals, especially women, which is even sort of the really good news, have been undertaking post-secondary education to an increasingly higher degree over the past few decades. But when we looked at the jobs that these individuals were holding, we found that more or less across the board, men and women, roughly a third, in some instances a little more, are holding a qualification or a credential which is higher than the one their job typically requires. So 1/3 of the workforce is, by this definition, overqualified. And so that kind of left us with a bit of a nut to crack, so to speak, is that how could we be, on the one hand, hearing from employers and surveys and other sort of practitioners that there's this big sort of skill shortage, but yet we have this highly qualified workforce that is in essence working in occupations where their skills qualifications, again, are not really being sort of put to the test, so to speak, or utilized in a way that we would typically think these qualifications should be used. And so that left us with really an understanding that thinking about qualifications as a proxy for skills is just not good enough. And so it left us with this notion of, okay, well, how can we better understand skills in this space of, all right, what does a job require in terms of its skills, in terms of its skill level? And then on the same side, how can we as a system understand what skills individuals are actually possessing? Otherwise, how could we be in a position to say whether or not, individual doesn't have enough skills for any given job? And so this is where this sort of shift from qualifications and credentials to skills becomes much more complicated and difficult to really uncover. The obvious benefit of using qualifications and credentials is the 0 to 1, right? It's quite clear. Go to a university or a college, and you either end up with the credential or you don't. And you can simply ask an employer, all right, do you need this credential or not? Simple yes or no. But now we've sort of moved into a slightly more complicated space where, all right, now we're talking about skills. And I think 2 or 3 things have come to mind. Is the first is a little bit like this conflation, if you will, between labor and skill shortages. We heard a lot of talk about skills, what skills were, without any real understanding or articulation of what skills are. So we've heard, transferable skills, soft skills, foundational skills, and none of those, at least from an individual perspective, means anything. Like, I'm not going to be able to go and get a course on soft skills, right? I mean, there are communication sort of courses, but what does that actually mean for an individual? How I can action sort of addressing what I think is sort of a skills deficit. And so this sort of confusion around how people were defining skills was obvious, right? And so educators and trainers were using it in a slightly different way than employers, who still have maybe more the mindset of thinking about qualifications. Individuals, in terms of how they acquire a skill, seem to differ in terms of how they think about and define skills. And so we were at a point where, okay, how is it that we can all speak the same language when it comes to skills, so that we can bring really these, what we see as the fundamental sort of pillars to addressing skills deficiencies is, okay, we can understand that employer needs a certain skill. An individual then knows how to upskill, and then the training provider can sort of help close that gap. But sort of defining skills, as difficult as that has been, but there's been some, I think, excellent work within the federal government based on some international examples of how we can sort of use that same language so we're not lost in translation. But then it becomes much more complicated in terms of how you measure this, right? So there are, some skills that have been well defined for some time. So literacy is an obvious one, for which, we have pretty good information on literacy levels of Canadians, right? But when we talk to employers, these aren't the skills they're necessarily talking about when they say they're having trouble finding people with the right skill set. It's something else. It's something much more complicated, which raises the question of really, how can you measure at an individual level a much more wider, diverse set of skills that goes beyond sort of your what are currently sort of 9 essential skills. So if we're talking about 30 or 40 type skills, which are central to kind of the training and education system and helping individuals move along the career path, for any one of those, how can we assess them sort of at a population level in a way that's meaningful? Or are we just kind of left to the device that, okay, the employer is going to, when interviewing candidates, do some sort of skill assessment or test, or, you know, be it quantitative or qualitative. Interview is obviously testing communication skills in some way, but it's very ad hoc, right? And very much left to the interpretation of any sort of given employer and their tests. And I think the individual is sort of left out in the cold, so to speak, in terms of better understanding what it is they should be doing from a skills perspective. And so I guess to sort of bring it all together in some way, qualifications and credentials will continue to remain a fundamental pillar to our workforce development strategy. But when we think about the fact that 1 in 3 employed Canadians are working in an occupation that requires a credential less than the one they have, and at a time when even you have high unemployment and employers are saying there are skills shortages, then we need something new and different in terms of labor market currencies that complement credentials and qualifications. And for us, that is obviously skills. But in our view, to kind of fundamentally move forward in terms of helping, again, employers, trainers, educators, and individuals, we think first we need to better define skills. And so we all understand what it is we're talking about when I say I can't find someone with transferable skills. So better definitions are clearly needed, so we're all speaking the same language, but we don't want to make it so really sort of pedantic that, you know, we're down to refining what oral communication skills mean, but all actors in some sense should be speaking the same language. Otherwise, I'm not sure how training and education providers can provide individuals with skill set that's needed by employers. The second big question for us then becomes, all right, even if we have sort of a common understanding of what skills are, how can we actually measure them on the individual side in a realistic way? Like, presumably we can't test individuals every year for 45 different skill sets. And then what does the proficiency look like? Because it's no longer a 0 or a 1, right? It's how proficient might you be in oral communication. And so what does that mean and translate on the employer side? And so we're really kind of at a stage now where, at least as an organization and working with some of our partners, we're thinking really about the different approaches through which we can kind of see a job through this new lens of skills. Because what we see as kind of imperative that has sort of been drawn or highlighted during the pandemic is that people will increasingly need to move from one job to another. And so how can whatever their existing skill portfolio looks like, how can that help them transition to potentially new and different opportunities, either within their existing job or to entirely new jobs because they've been sort of forced out in terms of unemployment or out of the labor market altogether. And so we're really kind of, I would say, at the beginning of this kind of work in terms of our partners. And I think Anthony is going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of what opportunities there are in terms of approaches of how to measure skills. But I would say, yeah, to sum up, this is probably one of the most important labor market information gaps that exists in helping Canadians, employers, and educators sort of navigate this new world, but it was also true before the pandemic. But I think there's a lot left to be done in terms of how we define and measure skills. So we can come back to what we consider our kind of main mandate is, how can we help Canadians sort of navigate these different decisions in terms of what they need to upskill or reskill so that they can be sort of successful in their career choices.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. So I think what we'll do is we'll have Anthony present, and then we'll open it up to the audience for any questions that they might have. So Anthony, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony. I'm a senior economist with the Labor Market Information Council. My work touches upon a wide range of issues impacting the labor market, but I would say that at the heart of all of them lies skills in some form or another. And as Stephen was saying, this topic has been of interest for the past several years, and I would say a policy concern as well. I think that with COVID-19 and the recent changes that we've seen both here in Canada and really globally, that there's been an acceleration and a sense of urgency around this topic that wasn't there before. So I think the topic itself is extremely interesting, very important. And today I'm excited to speak to you a little bit about where we came from and when we're going when it comes to skills data. For my presentation, I am going to use some PowerPoint slides. And there are two places that I'm going to ask for your input. So I would like to encourage you to use the chat box to reflect and respond to two questions that I'm going to pose to you as we move through. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right, so you should be able to see my presentation right now. So here's an image that I think really captures the message of Stephen's discussion. And essentially that there's this chasm between how students, job seekers, educators, training institutions think about and speak about skills and the way employers do. Their conceptualizations are different. The language they use is different. And on one side, we have thinking and language centering on programs, education levels, even fields of study. As Stephen was speaking to these idea of proxies for skills or skill sets, the Knox skill level, for example. On the other side, we have lists of skills or other work requirements. And I want to point out here that through my presentation, I'll probably switch between the skills and work requirements. But I wanted to point out that from a research perspective, when we speak about skills, we speak about something very specific in the sense that there's a distinction in the literature between skills and abilities and knowledge areas and tools and technology, for example. All of these can be seen sort of generally as work requirements. So what one person is referring to when they mean skills differs. And this is essentially one of the reasons why when we started our work at LMIC, we identified an importance around the language and the lexicon being used and really starting to identify and come up with clear definitions and descriptions of what it is that we mean. So all of this is to say great, right? We know that technological progress is advancing at a rapid pace. We know that there's other factors that are affecting the nature of work. And speaking about skills through proxies is no longer sufficient. I don't think that probably anybody here would argue or refute that actual skills information is better than, let's say, knowing that somebody has completed a bachelor's degree. But this begs an important question, which is where does or where will this information come from? So at this stage, I actually would like to invite you to use the chat. And I want to ask you, where do you get skills information from? You know, if you've looked for skills information on your own, what sources have you used? If you've never looked for skills information, do you know of any sources? And I really would like some answers here. So I'm going to pause for about 30 seconds to give you an option or an opportunity to reflect and to respond to this, and then we'll continue. Job postings, yeah, Google, alumni emails, MC. ESDC, yeah, conference board. Yeah, so great. I think that we can see NOC classification, workforce planning boards. Yeah, the NOC codes, definitely seeing some consistency here with some of the responses. Okay, so this is great. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. And I think that of the sources named, they really can be traced back to one of two sources. One being occupational profiles, and the other being online job postings that you might be accessing directly or through some other type of service provider, such as MC or Job Bank, for example. So the reality is that the majority of skills information that we have and that we use empirically, and by this I mean that from our perspective, as Stephen was talking about skill shortages, for example, identifying and measuring shortages, even doing things like trying to estimate the likelihood of automation, for example, which is another huge issue, a skills-related topic. The data come from occupational profiles. And one of the most common sources or main sources in Canada is Job Bank and Career Handbook. This information is made available and connected with other labor market information, such as the NOC codes, the occupations. And then in the US, we have Own It, which is really seen as the gold standard globally, okay, with regards to the skills and other job and worker characteristics that it contains. So what I want to do now is just quickly go through a little bit to see you get an idea of what information is actually presented in these sources. So the example that you're looking at right now, here is a snapshot for an occupation for welders. I chose welders just because my sister recently graduated from a welding program, so I thought it would be appropriate. But under the skills tab for Job Bank, you see here this category of expertise. And if you look through them, these read like work tasks or work activities. All right, we have operate brakes, fit, braze, torch, straighten metal, etc. Under skills and knowledge, okay, we have a couple of skills and knowledge areas that are listed: building, constructing, restoring and repairing, analyzing information, public safety and security here is a knowledge area. All right, so this is the main data source for us and for empirical use when it comes to trying to get information on skills. Okay, this source here is the skills information that comes from Own It. So Own It is the US system, Occupational Information Network. They have occupational profiles, of which skills is one aspect. Within the Own It system, there are 35 skills that are defined. And each skill for each occupation is given one of two ratings. They're rated on a scale for importance, and then they're rated on a scale, what they call level, which is sort of, it's basically complexity, okay? And then these scores are standardized from 1 to 100. So what you're looking at here in this slide is for welders, the 35 skills in Own It, and they're ranked here according to the importance rating. So we see that the top 3 skills having the highest importance for welders is monitoring, critical thinking, and quality control analysis. Now, one thing that I want to point out, and again, kind of tying it back into this empirical use for skill shortages, for example, is that this is how we identify skill shortages, okay, from the empirical perspective. The way that it's done is that either a forecast is made of employment into the future by occupation. So we could say, for example, using some sort of statistical method, that employment for welders is expected to grow 20%, okay, which I'm making up, in the next 5 to 10 years. That increase is said to be much faster than average. So the idea here is that because the supply tends to lag demand, if it's determined that the demand is supposed to increase, there's the potential for a shortage condition to develop, okay? The other way empirically is to use just job vacancies, all right? So here, the National Statistics Canada uses the Job Vacancy and Wage Survey. This is an employer-based survey, and it asks employers to identify their vacancies. So one of these two ways is used to try to understand the potential demand in the future, which is great for labor, okay? But again, this idea of labor shortage versus skills shortage, where does the actual skills information come from? And it comes from this. What happens is we identify a potential shortage for, let's say, welders, and we now tie the skills from an occupational profile to this. So we say, great, we expect there to be a shortage for welders in the next 5 years. The top 3 skills here using ONET data for importance is monitoring, critical thinking, quality control analysis. So we expect there to be a shortage of monitoring skills in the future. We expect there to be a shortage of critical thinking skills in the future. Now, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but essentially this is the method that's done. And this is how we attach skills information when it comes to looking at shortages. Things like estimating automation, for example, the risk of automation uses the exact same data source. It uses the skills, also work tasks, and some other dimensions, mostly from ONET data, because it is seen as to be the most robust and most complete source of data. And oftentimes there's some mathematical formula that's attached to this, along with expert review and expert opinion. And then a statement is made, a metric is formed as to say the likelihood of a certain skill being declared possibly come to be in shortage, okay? So I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I would also like to give you an opportunity now to just think about whether or not this information, or how useful is this information to you, okay? Do you find something like this useful in the sense that if we're thinking about ONET, we have these types of ratings. Interestingly, ESDC is starting to build their own occupational profile system that's Canadian-based. It too will start to have a rating system for importance. The rating system will be binary, so it'll be yes, it's important, or no, it's not. But the idea here again is to try to build some sort of measures that we can then use for some sort of statistical analysis to make these types of decisions. But I wanted to quickly pose it to you that is a system such as this useful for your purposes and for the types of work that you do here? And again, I would ask you to just use the chat box to share with us, to what extent do you find a list of skills like this with potential ratings, again, in ONET's case, for importance or complexity, how useful is it to you? Is it useful at all? So I'm going to pause again for about 30 seconds to give you an opportunity to reflect and respond, and then we'll move on. Okay, so very useful. Okay, helpful for relevant for training purposes. Yeah, decisions for making their next step. Educational institutions. A list of 35 can be cumbersome for students to work with. Training purposes, all right. So I'm seeing a lot of consistency here when it comes to finding usefulness of this information for training, although the set of skills might be a little overwhelming for some. So one of the things, so I'm actually very, not surprised, but I think that's excellent that you found this information useful. From a measurement perspective, some of the things that we've identified as being less than useful or maybe a limitation to this sort of data is that there's a couple of assumptions that we find is not necessarily realistic when we're trying to identify, let's say, shortages. And one of those is that all of the workers within a given occupation are expected to have the same set of skills, right? So if we're thinking about the welding example again, we see the different ratings. There's an assumption here that every single welder across all industries, regardless of years of experience, will have that particular level or will have that particular skill, which we know is not necessarily an accurate assumption or a statement. Second, and this is probably the most troublesome for us, especially now with COVID and the way technological change is affecting the future of work, and that's that these skills are static. These 35 don't change. Now, ONET itself starts to update every 5 years. Job Bank, in terms of updates, I don't have the exact update in mind at the moment, but they are, like I said, we're trying to expand this and improve upon it. But the skills themselves are static skills, and there's very little change to the skills themselves, right? So as I was saying, with respect to the nature of work changing due to technological advancement and things, what we refer to as megatrends of the future of work, the static skills isn't flexible enough really to capture the variability in the labor market and in terms of the individual skills that employers are looking for. And so this is where I want to turn our attention to that second data source that some of you identified in the first question that I asked, which is online job postings. And so for me, this is, the question becomes, is there a better way? And if we're thinking about matching students and current job seekers, we need to know what skills employers want, right? And we need to know the language that employers are talking in. So thanks to advances in data management and new technologies such as AI, it's now possible to leverage the data from online job postings to complement official statistics for labor market analysis. And this is relatively new. Online job posting data used just to estimate demand, for example, started appearing in the literature around 2017. So we're talking within the last 4 years, 3 to 4 years really. And then now using artificial intelligence coupled with with machine learning specifically and natural language processing, these postings can be scraped, their content organized and structured, and really categorized so we can get information based upon occupation. We can get information at more granular levels, for example. So that detail of information that before wasn't available, we see as a possibility using online job postings, right? So this idea of real-time data, local data, okay? One of the downsides to using some of the national statistics and sources that we have is that data is available at the provincial level, okay, maybe. At the economic region level, sub-provincially, rarely, okay, at least rarely publicly available. And even when you have special access to this data, the data is often suppressed because of confidentiality reasons. There's no such confidentiality constraints when we're looking at job posting data, right? So the availability to look at below CMA level opens up to us, which is important when we're talking about shortages and in demand, because we know that labor markets are geographically delimited, right? So having the most local data is very important to us. And I think what's even more important, again, we come back to skills, is that detailed information on the skills and other work requirements is available. So as a data source, online job postings really address a lot of the limitations that we've seen with other data sources, such as ONET or Job Bank, for example. Although I will highlight that some of these sources are now incorporating web scraping into their platforms to try to build and augment their research. So with that, I want to say that there's several data analytic firms in Canada that provide this type of data. Burning Glass Technologies, which I would assume a lot of you are probably familiar with. Talent Neuron is another. Vicinity Jobs is another big data analytics firm located in BC. And this data, while it's nice to have, it's not always available to the public in a transparent way. So LMIC, what we've done is we've contacted with Vicinity Jobs, and we've tried to make this data available to the public in a transparent way, where the methodology for how the data is scraped is identified and explained, and the information from the job postings are available for download. Now, I want to walk you through and show you that platform in just a second, but this is where I think, again, the idea of emerging skills is important. And I love to give the example of a real estate agent. So my mom is a real estate agent, and when she started, the skills that you needed, I would say basic math, a closing sheet. There was an actual sheet that you sort of filled in the cells for, you filled in the columns. You needed a lot of personal skills, communication skills, relationship building skills. Now you have real estate agents who are doing regression analysis. Okay, so you see that the evolution of skills needed within an occupation are changing over time, and that changing is definitely accelerating, right? And this type of acceleration is not necessarily captured through static taxonomies, and it's one of the main advantages for us when it comes to online job posting data. So here you have, this is a link to our website, which I'll make available just from our website here. It's our Canadian online job posting dashboard. And, oops, sorry, my screen just there. All right. So what I want to point out here is this tool, we can search by occupation. We can see the skill requirements that are available by job postings. So I'm going to just highlight 2020. We'll look at the year only. I want to keep it at the 4-digit knock for the 4-digit occupation level. I think that's usually the most relevant for most people.
Anthony?
Yes.
Are you showing us on screen? Because we can't.
I should be. You're not looking at it?
It has not shared with us yet.
Oh,
No.
okay, great. Thank you. Let me.
Just stop sharing the one and then reshare.
Okay, perfect. Stop sharing. Screen share. Okay. Is that working now?
Yeah,
Yes.
perfect. Good to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the tool. Essentially, we have a lot of background information in the foreground here, which outlines the limitations to online job posting data, how the data was scraped, et cetera, an FAQ section. But the bread and butter here is the search tool. So to give you an illustration, I'm going to search for all occupations. Here, I've set the time period to 2020 for the whole year. And the knock level here is just a 4-digit occupation that we have. So by hitting search, this first table populates, and we see the list of knock with the number of online job postings that were available for 2020. So the total number of postings for 2020, okay, we see here the 2 million, approximately 2 million. Retail salespersons were 56,300, all right? And we see that that's a decrease from the previous year, 2019, about 40%. And we see that for all the different occupations here, just simply the number of job postings that were available. For any one of these occupations, we can click on it, and a second table below will populate with the actual work requirements that were specified in the online job postings. So we hear communication skills were specified in 45% of all of those. So of those 32,000 job postings, 45% of them, employers listed communication skills as an actual skill. All right. And these are just a scrollable list here of all the different types of skills. So this is one way to use the tool if you want to look for individual occupations. It could be helpful for counseling capacity, for example. I want to highlight, as I was talking before, this idea of emerging skills. So I'm going to switch to the work requirement view. And I want to look at machine learning, because this is a big skill that we see a lot of, a big knowledge area here. So I'm going to change to 2019. Going to do a search. Okay, so we see that there were 1,000 postings. Now we can see the different types of occupations that actually listed machine learning. We have ones that we would expect: database analysts, software engineers, right? Things related to the computing industry. But look at this now as we scroll down: university professors and lecturers. 102 postings listed machine learning as a work requirement. Okay, corporate sales managers. So here's one that I'm willing to wager, even 5 years ago, a corporate sales manager probably did not have machine learning listed as one of their work requirements. All right, just to actually give us a little bit of a larger list here, we're going to look at artificial intelligence. We'll look at the same time period here and see how AI ranges in the different types of occupations. All right, again, we have the ones we would expect: database and computers, engineering managers, web designers, university professors, lecturers. But here's one that I find interesting: business development officers and marketing researchers and consultants, advertising and marketing and public relations. Okay, so what I think is very telling here is that we have occupations, post-secondary teaching, financial managers, that in the past, or maybe just intuitively, we wouldn't have expected certain work requirements to show up, but now they do, right? And being able to see over time this change in work requirements, I think, is very important. And for us, from an empirical perspective, it really helps us to have a more refined understanding when we're trying to identify things like shortages, for example, and trying to understand these individual granular work requirements to help match job seekers, students with jobs, and even when it comes to training, right, and potentially curricular design and program development. So I'm just going to go back to my presentation here. Okay, so I believe you should be seeing that. All right, and this kind of takes me to the end here of what I wanted to say, which is that, you know, learning achievements, the way that learning is being assessed is really changing. A lot of this is coming down to the way and the changes that we need in terms of identifying skills. You know, for those of you who are educators, I actually come from a background in education, worked as a high school teacher for a couple of years prior to working in economics. And assessments, you know, letter grades, I think, you know, it's, a lot of educators are understanding and familiar with the fact that a grade doesn't necessarily translate well into mastery of a certain skill or even a learning objective, right? It's common to get a good grade, but still fail to master a learning objective. And employers are looking for more granular understanding and mastery of specific skills, right? So starting to build an understanding of what skills employers are looking for, and then really trying to tie these into better development for training and assessment to facilitate, to better measure skill acquisition. I think that the new technology, this new era of using web scraping and trying to identify these skills from online job posting data is really where a lot of organizations are moving to. It's what we've invested a lot of time and energy into understanding, because it's not perfect, right? We know, for example, that not all postings are available online. There's some bias, you know, when it comes to representativeness, which we've actually written some reports on. We've compared it, for example, to job vacancy data that's nationally representative from Statistics Canada. But overall, it offers us some a better glimpse into the individual skills. And I think that this helps in this transition because there is talk when it comes to education of moving toward a competency-based education and micro-credentialing. I think of Google and some of the other major IT app players in the field, no longer emphasizing or looking at individual credentials, but placing their individual training programs, if you will, or certification badges, all right, these micro credentials that Google offers online, for example, through Coursera and other MOOCs, as equal to a bachelor's degree. So I think that this is really the trend that's starting, and that what we can do to sort of help training and education align with that will be beneficial to everybody. So I think that's everything that I wanted to say here. I'll turn it back over to Sandra. So thank you.
Thank you. That was pretty awesome information. So I'm wondering now if we want to spend a few minutes and actually ask some questions of both the gentlemen. And I'm thinking the best way to do it would be through the chat box. So I'll give you a moment to ask some questions of Anthony and Steve. And just as you're thinking about that, I just want to say, first of all, Steve, I really, really appreciated how you described the difference between labor and shortage and skill shortage, because I think people do not have a good understanding of that. And so and I look at the skill shortage, it seems to me it's more of a skills mismatch than it is anything else. So thank you for doing that. And Anthony, the labor market information that you presented, the tools are really interesting, because I like many hadn't heard of them. One of the questions I think that did come up while you were speaking is, do we have access to the labor market information center, like your tool that you were showing us with all the skills? And
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that as an organization that's very high for us is public transparency and public data, and everything that we do is available for free and is publicly available. So I'm actually I'm gonna post a link to that particular tool in the chat box here.
Okay. The other interesting thing I was just, sorry, I was taking tons of notes when you guys were speaking, but I was thinking that it seems like, yes, it's moving more towards kind of looking for skills as opposed to maybe the education piece. But I think what still is missing, and maybe I missed it from your presentation, but I think employers and people in general are defining the different skills differently. So then how do we know exactly what it is that our clients need? Because communication skills to me, for example, might be different from somebody else. So how do we navigate that part of it?
Yeah, so I can take a start, and then Stephen, if you want to add to that. So I would say that that's a great point, and that's one of the key areas that we identified when we first set out, was that there was a lack of consistency in terminology. So what we've done at LMIC is really try to focus on creating consistency around language. So we've done that a couple of ways. One is to just create reports where we document recommendations for how certain terminology should be used and what we mean by them. We've created a work words, which is a basically labor market lexicon, if you will, where we have a variety of labor market related topics such as skills, occupation outlooks, vacancies, occupations, where we explain the topic in detail. We link to various data sources. Occupation entry, for example, explains the entire NOC structure, how it's used. So by encouraging adoption and trying to disseminate and spread what we would recommend for certain use, I think is a key to that step. And then also, I think in having these types of conversations, right? Participating in forums like that we are today. I know myself, I get to participate in various webinars with career development practitioners, and communicating this information as well with employers and trying to be consistent. We also leverage our relationship with the federal and provincial governments. So we work alongside with Statistics Canada and ESDC. ESDC has recently released their skills and competency taxonomy, which they have, very specific definitions for skills, knowledge, and abilities. So making sure that the products that we do aligns with what the federal government is doing, and vice versa, right? They're making sure that they align with what we're doing. So just having that cross communication, that relationship building, and getting everything out there, I think is kind of on the way to address that.
I
Awesome.
mean, the only thing I would maybe add, I think, is, and this relates very much to the great comment I see from Kathleen and Victor, is that when we think about the old system, it was at least pretty straightforward that the responsibility of the education institutions, the government, and the individual was to get a qualification. Then at that point, the employer would take over, so to speak, right? So they would take the individual, they would be considered very qualified, and they would provide the skills and training in the workplace that would enable the individual and the firm to succeed. And that was pretty much understood in terms of the various roles and responsibilities. But now we're in this space where the system is now broken, and employers are kind of saying, well, people are coming out and they're not skilled. And so one thing I think which we need to have, I think, a bigger discussion around, which means bringing together all the different partners, is understanding the roles and responsibilities of the various players, right? So is it the education institution responsibility to skill people as well as to provide credentials? Is it the individual's responsibility to understand, it's machine learning, so now I better go get some machine learning? And what is kind of the role of employers? And so to me, and thinking about the definitions and how we use the same language, an important part of that conversation is, can we get a better understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are in this new way of talking about workforce development? And unless we have that, definitions will only be able to get you so far if employers continue to think, well, it's the individual and education responsibilities to some extent. So.
Well, it's interesting because one of the questions, actually, I was just looking on the chat, has something to do with what you were talking about. It says, Victor was asking, do employers still need to play a role in developing skills of job seekers? Part of micro-credentialing to me seems to put the emphasis on the individual finding training programs rather than a more systematic approach to building skills in the workforce. So I think you kind of touched on that with your last comments. Okay. Any other questions that you have for Anthony and Stephen?
I do. Anthony, you were mentioning you use ONET. What was it you're using Job Bank for? Because you were saying you use a couple of them in tandem.
Yeah, so the point that I was trying to emphasize is that from an empirical perspective, ONET tends to be what's used in academia and in research around skill shortages in terms of measurement. And really, ONET in particular, because of those ratings. The ratings have been used a lot. For Canadian context, Job Bank is really what we have when it comes to skills. Yeah. So I was trying to emphasize that we have something similar, and that ESDC is now working on developing something that's more similar to ONET in the sense that we have these types of rating measurements that's more particular for the Canadian context, but it doesn't exist currently. So just trying to emphasize that really these were the two main sources of skills data, are occupational profiles. And for us in Canada, we've got Job Bank, or we have to use a US system for ONET.
Right, okay. And ONET is not available, like you purchased that, so that's not available to the public then through your site?
So not through our site, but it's available publicly through their sites. So if you use their ONET website, all of their data is available for download. It's actually another reason why I think a lot of researchers use their data. ONET itself generated from, it's been around for a long time. It was a dictionary of occupational titles back in the 40s. And in the 90s and 2000s, it kind of went through this period of renovation. It has a large theoretical backing to it in terms of the skills. It has the data is collected through employer surveys. Job analysts rate the skills. So it's really the most comprehensive data that's available freely to the public, which is one of the reasons why I think researchers tend to favor it as well. But you can download the data and it's all free as well.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, one more. With Vicinity Jobs, do they scrape everybody's website for postings?
So Canada, it's so Canadian only. It focuses both French and English.
Yes.
We do have a listing, I think, of all of the different job sites, but it's provincial sites. So the provincial employment sites get scraped. You have like the major things. Job Bank, for example, is included in there. Monster, some of the big job aggregators, Indeed, for example, is in there, as well as the provincial sites as well. So I think it's a good representation of what's available. And the fact that it scrapes both French and English postings is another advantage for us when it comes to trying to identify skills.
I have a couple of other questions in the chat box. So first of all, it says, Steve, are you seeing any skill shortages in the current pandemic work environment?
I mean, difficult to say. Certainly, we've noticed a shift in terms of the skill requirements and looking at kind of the job postings, right? So shortages, I think, yeah, too tough to say, but definitely we've seen kind of a shift in sort of not only the types of jobs that are on offer, but obviously the skill composition of that, right? Like one sort of piece in analyzing the job postings early on in the pandemic of March and April, we saw that like security guards and delivery drivers skyrocketed. And they were also looking primarily, or at least in addition to kind of some obvious skills, they're also looking for bilingual positions. So they wanted people to be able to speak French and English to people who would be going in or trying to get into stores. So maybe one other comment, I know we're running short on time, is Kathleen, in terms of your question, I would say, is there good information on employer investments in 2019 or 2018 or 2017? I mean, basically there isn't a lot of good information in terms of what we know in terms of the dollars and cents that employers put on the table for training. The one thing I would say is that yes, the evidence is definitely dated, and smaller employers would tell you that they don't actually spend money on training, which would explain lower investments, but rather the training is sort of on the job and working with others. And so difficult topic, but yes, there's definitely an absence of good information in terms of the levels of investments and training by employers in Canada.
Okay, awesome.